If stories like this matter to you, and they should, consider subscribing. Hit like if you believe accountability starts with awareness. And leave a comment. What do you think happens when the people meant to protect become the ones who harm? There is a document. It exists. It was verified. And for a long time, the people in charge pretended it did in single quotas. In the state of Idaho, inside a women's correctional facility, something was being reported quietly, persistently, at great personal risk to the women doing the reporting. The women were incarcerated. Their words carried a particular kind of weight in that world. Not the weight of credibility. The weight of consequence. To speak was to risk everything. To stay silent was to endure everything. Some chose silence. Others could not. What they described in written grievances, in whispered conversations, in formal complaints filed, and then seemingly buried, painted a picture of systematic abuse behind institutional walls. Not random. Not isolated. Pattern. The kind of pattern that takes time to build. The kind that requires complicity to survive. Idaho's Department of Corrections is not a small operation. It manages thousands of lives across multiple facilities. It employs correctional officers, administrators, counselors, medical staff. It answers, in theory, to the public, to elected officials, to the law. But institutions, even public ones, develop their own internal gravity. Information flows inward. Accountability flows slowly, if at all. When a verified report surfaced documenting rampant sexual abuse of women prisoners by staff, the response from the department's director was not acknowledgement. It was denial. Not quiet, bureaucratic deflection. Active denial. The kind that required someone to look at documented evidence and choose a different story. That choice, and the machinery that supported it, is what this documentary is about. Because the report didn't disappear. Verified findings rarely do. Entirely. They survive in court filings, in journalist inboxes, in the memories of women who lived what the documents described. This is a story about what happens when institutional power meets documented truth, about who gets believed in America's correctional system and who does not. About the particular vulnerability of incarcerated women, whose voices exist in a space where credibility is perpetually questioned and access to justice is structurally limited. It is also a story about the investigators, advocates, and journalists who refuse to let the report stay buried, about what it costs to pursue accountability inside a system designed, at every level, to resist it. We begin where most investigations begin, not with a revelation, but with a question someone asked that they were told firmly not to pursue. They pursued it anyway. What they found was not comfortable. It was not simple, but it was documented. It was verified. And it deserved to be seen. This is the story of what happens when the walls are supposed to protect, and instead conceal. There is a particular silence that exists inside correctional facilities. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of systems designed to suppress. Inside Idaho's women's correctional facility, that silence had layers. Layers built from policy, from power, from the daily mathematics of who gets believed. The women held inside those walls came from different backgrounds, different crimes, different stories. What many shared, however, was a common institutional experience. The experience of reporting something and watching it disappear. Grievance systems in American prisons exist on paper as a form of accountability. In practice, they often function differently. A woman files a complaint. The complaint enters a process. That process is managed, in many cases, by the same institution being complained about. The inherent conflict is structural. It is not an accident. Former inmates who later spoke to investigators and journalists described a culture of calculated silence. To complain formally was to make yourself visible, in a way that carried risk, visible to the very staff whose conduct you were reporting. Some women described being moved, housing reassignments following complaints. Others described subtler pressures, small daily humiliations that communicated, without explicit threat, that speaking had consequences. The message was never written down. It didn't need to be. Institutions communicate through atmosphere as much as through policy. And in this facility, the atmosphere around reporting was suffocated. What makes the Idaho case particularly significant is the nature of what was being reported. Not contraband disputes, not facility condition grievances. The complaints, documented across multiple reports and investigations, described sexual misconduct by correctional staff. In American prisons, this category of abuse carries specific federal weight. The Prison Rape Elimination Act, known as PRA, was passed in 2003 specifically to address this vulnerability. It mandated reporting standards, investigation protocols, accountability mechanisms. It was supposed to change the culture. What happened in Idaho suggests that legislation, without genuine institutional will, can become another layer of bureaucratic insulation. PRA audits were conducted, certifications were issued, and still, the reports kept coming. Women described staff members who understood the boundaries of formal procedure well enough to operate near them, who understood which shifts provided less oversight. Who understood which women were least likely to be believed if they reported. Incarcerated women who have prior convictions, mental health histories, or substance abuse records carry those histories into every institutional interaction. The credibility calculation is performed against them before they speak a single word. Investigators, who later reviewed the pattern of complaints, noted something significant. The reports weren't coming from one woman or two. They were coming from multiple women across time, describing similar dynamics, similar locations, similar staff. That pattern consistency across independent reporters is what transforms individual allegations into documented evidence of systemic failure. It is also what makes denial increasingly difficult to sustain credibly. And yet, denial was precisely what arrived. Not investigation, not acknowledgement, not the quiet reassignment of staff pending review. Denial. From the top of the department's leadership structure. The director of the Idaho Department of Corrections looked at what had been compiled, what had been verified, and chose a public posture of dismissal. That decision would have consequences no one in that administration fully anticipated, because outside the walls, people were paying attention. Journalists, advocates, legal organizations specializing in prisoner rights, people who understood that verified reports don't simply dissolve because an official refuses to acknowledge them. They wait, they accumulate, they eventually find light. The women who filed those reports may not have known their words would outlast the silence imposed on them, but they wrote them anyway. That act of writing, of documenting, of refusing to let experience remain unrecorded would become the foundation of everything that followed. Asterisk. There is a difference between an allegation and a verified finding. That difference matters enormously in institutional accountability. An allegation can be dismissed, questioned, attributed to motive or instability. A verified finding is something else entirely. It has survived scrutiny. It has been tested against evidence, against documentation, against the accounts of multiple independent sources. When investigators produce a verified finding, dismissing it requires a different kind of institutional courage. That reckless kind. The report at the center of this story was not produced casually. It emerged from a serious investigative process involving documentation of complaints across an extended period. Multiple women, consistent patterns, corroborating details that independent reporters could not have coordinated. The kind of evidentiary architecture that investigators recognize immediately as significant. What the report described was not ambiguous. It outlined a pattern of sexual misconduct by correctional staff targeting incarcerated women within Idaho's system. It identified systemic failures in reporting mechanisms are the very channels designed to surface and address exactly this kind of abuse. It raised serious questions about whether protections were functioning as legislation intended, or functioning merely on paper. The report's findings were, by any standard investigative measure, serious enough to demand institutional response at the highest level, serious enough that silence or deflection would itself become a form of evidence. And yet, what came from the Idaho Department of Corrections director was not the response the findings demanded. It was denial. Public stated deliberate denial. The director disputed the characterization of what the report contained. He pushed back against the framing, against the language of verification. He offered, instead, the institutional counter-narrative that corrections departments have deployed for decades, that incarcerated individuals make false claims, that staff are professionals operating under scrutiny, that the system has mechanisms, audits, oversight, grievance procedures that would have surfaced genuine misconduct. It is a coherent-sounding argument. In isolation, it collapses, however, against the documented evidence that those very mechanisms had failed, that grievances had been filed and not meaningfully acted upon, that pre-audits had been passed while the complaints continued accumulating beneath them, that the architecture of accountability had been present in form and absent in function. Outside the department's walls, the denial produced a different kind of reaction. Legal advocates who had been tracking Idaho's correctional system for years recognized the pattern immediately. This was not the first time documentation had met institutional resistance in this system. It was, however, one of the most explicitly documented cases of a director publicly contradicting verified investigative findings. That specificity mattered. It created a paper trail not just of the original abuse, but of the institutional response to it. Both trails now existed. Both were discoverable. Journalists began filing records requests. Legal organizations began reviewing whether litigation pathways were viable. Former inmates who had remained silent began, cautiously, reconsidering that silence. The director's denial had not contained the story. It had, in a deeply consequential way, expanded it. Because now the question was no longer only what had happened inside those walls. The question was what the people in charge knew, when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. That question, the knowledge question, is the one that breaks institutions. And somewhere inside the Idaho Department of Corrections, in filing cabinets and email servers and administrative records, the answer was waiting. It is always waiting. The only variable is who finds it first. And what we are about to show you in the next chapter suggests that what was buried goes far deeper than anyone publicly acknowledged, involving decisions made at levels that will make you question everything you thought you understood about oversight in this system. Asterisk. Institutions do not maintain silence by accident. Silence, at the scale of a state correctional department, requires infrastructure. It requires people who know when not to ask questions, people who understand that their career trajectory runs parallel to institutional loyalty, people who have learned, through observation or direct instruction, where the invisible lines are drawn. Inside Idaho's correctional system, those lines had been drawn carefully. The grievance process was one mechanism, but it was not the only one. There were supervisory chains that determined which reports traveled upward and which did not. There were classification systems that affected how complaints were categorized. There were informal cultures on individual shifts, in individual facilities, that shaped what staff considered worth documenting. Each layer represented a potential point where information could slow, distort, or stop entirely. Investigators who examined the system's response to abuse complaints found something consistent, not a single dramatic moment of suppression. Instead, a series of smaller institutional decisions that collectively produced the same outcome. Reports that were filed but not escalated, investigations that were open but not completed with meaningful urgency. Staff who were the subject of multiple complaints continuing in their roles without visible consequence. The pattern was not chaotic. It had a logic to it. The logic of an institution protecting its operational continuity over the welfare of the people in its custody. That logic is not unique to Idaho. It appears documented and litigated in correctional systems across the United States. What made the Idaho situation distinctive was the accumulation of verified findings meeting public denial at the director level. That specific collision produced a documentary record of institutional failure that was unusually complete. Former staff members, speaking later under conditions of anonymity, described a workplace culture with significant pressure around certain topics. Questions about specific staff members were discouraged in informal ways. Concerns raised internally seemed to dissipate without resolution. New employees learned quickly which subjects were professionally hazardous to pursue. This is the mechanism that researchers who study institutional abuse describe as normalization. The gradual process through which abnormal conduct becomes absorbed into the operational background. It doesn't happen through explicit orders in most cases. It happens through the accumulation of small signals that tell people what the institution values and what it doesn't. For the women inside the facility, this normalization had a different name. They called it, in various ways, just how things are. The phrase appears repeatedly in accounts from former inmates across different facilities and different states. It signals something profound about institutional power. When abuse becomes expected, reporting it requires not just courage but a fundamental act of belief that the system, somewhere above the immediate environment of harm, might actually function differently. That belief is difficult to sustain inside a correctional facility, especially when every formal attempt at reporting has produced either silence or consequence. And yet, some women sustained it. They filed the reports. They submitted the grievances. They spoke to investigators when investigators eventually arrived. They did this knowing that the institution's memory was long, and their own vulnerability significant. What they could not have fully anticipated was that their documentation would eventually reach people outside the institutional structure entirely, people who were not subject to the same career pressures, the same supervisory chains, people who had their own institutional architecture of journalism, of law, of advocacy, and whose incentives ran in precisely the opposite direction, toward exposure, not concealment. That convergence of documented internal evidence meeting external investigative capacity is what correctional systems most fear. And in Idaho, that convergence was already underway. The silence was not yet broken, but it was fracturing. In ways that would soon become impossible to contain. There is a moment in every institutional cover-up when the boundary breaks. When the information that was managed internally encounters a force it cannot absorb. For Idaho's Department of Corrections, that moment arrived incrementally, not as a single dramatic exposure, but as a series of quiet, determined intrusions. Journalists filed public records requests. Legal organizations submitted formal inquiries. Advocacy groups that had been monitoring Idaho's correctional system for years began connecting documented complaints to broader patterns they had tracked across multiple states. Each inquiry, individually, could be managed. Collectively, they represented something the institution had not fully anticipated, a convergence of external scrutiny arriving from multiple directions. Simultaneously, investigative journalists who covered correctional systems were familiar with the Idaho Department of Corrections. It had appeared in previous reporting on prison conditions, staffing practices, and inmate welfare, but the verified report on sexual abuse by staff represented a qualitative escalation. This was not a facilities complaint, not a staffing ratio dispute. This was documented, verified evidence of serious criminal conduct by people employed in positions of total authority over vulnerable women. The journalists who pursued the story understood what that specificity meant legally and institutionally. It meant that denial carried a different kind of risk than it would for a routine administrative complaint. Denial of a verified finding in writing by a department director creates a documented record of a specific institutional posture. That record becomes discoverable in litigation. It becomes part of the evidentiary architecture in civil rights lawsuits. It becomes the kind of document that plaintiff attorneys highlight for juries. Legal organizations specializing in prisoner civil rights began reviewing whether the pattern of documented complaints, combined with the department's response, met the threshold for federal civil rights action. The standard is demanding deliberate indifference to known constitutional violations, but the documented record in Idaho was beginning to outline exactly that standard with uncomfortable clarity. Outside, legal pressure was building from another direction. Simultaneously, former inmates who had left the system and were no longer subject to its immediate authority began speaking more openly. Distance from incarceration, while not eliminating fear, changes the calculus of disclosure. Some connected with advocacy organizations that provided legal support and safe channels for testimony. Their accounts, gathered independently across different time periods, described consistent dynamics, consistent locations within the facility, consistent patterns of staff behavior, consistent failures of reporting mechanisms. The consistency was not coincidental. It was the kind of pattern that emerges when systemic problem has existed long enough to become embedded in institutional culture. Meanwhile, within Idaho's political structure, the department's public denial was beginning to attract uncomfortable attention. Legislators who sat on oversight committees were receiving inquiries from constituents, from advocacy organizations, from journalists seeking comment. Political oversight of correctional departments is frequently passive in American states. Legislators generally engage with corrections when something becomes publicly undeniable. Idaho's situation was approaching that threshold. The department's director remained publicly committed to his denial, but the institutional ground beneath that position was shifting in ways that administrative statements could not stabilize. Because the documents existed, the verified findings existed, and the women who had lived the experiences described in those findings were still alive, still speaking, still willing to tell anyone who would genuinely listen what they had endured. Institutions can manage internal dissent with remarkable efficiency. They cannot manage the moment when that dissent finds an external voice that carries its own authority. That voice was now speaking, clearly, documentably, in channels the institution could not control or suppress. The walls, which had contained so much for so long, were no longer sufficient. What remained to be seen was whether accountability would follow exposure. In American correctional history, exposure and accountability are not the same thing. They do not arrive together automatically. One is always easier than the other. Accountability in American institutional life rarely arrives as justice. It arrives more often as process. As investigations that take longer than anyone outside the system finds acceptable. As administrative reviews that produce recommendations rather than consequences. As settlements that come with no admission of wrongdoing. As resignations that are framed as retirements. As systemic reforms that are announced with press releases and implemented with varying degrees of commitment. This is not cynicism. It is the documented pattern of how American institutions respond to verified evidence of their own failure. Idaho's correctional system would not prove an exception to that pattern. The external pressure that had been building up from journalists, legal organizations, advocates, former inmates, eventually produced visible institutional movement, not the dramatic reckoning that the severity of the verified findings might have warranted. But movement. Investigations were announced or expanded. Legislative inquiries were initiated. The language around the department's public posture began, incrementally, to shift, not toward full acknowledgement, not toward the kind of direct institutional accountability that the women who had filed those original grievances deserved, but away from the absolute denial that had defined the director's initial response. That shift, subtle as it was, carried its own significance. It meant the documented findings had been impossible to sustain denial against indefinitely. It meant the architecture of silence had developed fractures that institutional management could no longer fully repair. For the women whose complaints had initiated this entire sequence of events, the institutional response was complicated to witness. Some had waited years for any acknowledgement that what they reported had been real, had been documented, had been taken seriously by someone with the authority to act. What arrived was partial, bureaucratic, etched with the language of ongoing process. It was not what the experience had cost them. Nothing institutional ever fully is. The deeper question that the Idaho case raises leaves, in many ways, and resolved is structural. It is not only about what happened in one facility in one state. It is about the conditions that allow patterns of staff misconduct to persist inside correctional systems. Broadly. About the pre-framework and whether its implementation has genuine teeth or remains primarily a compliance exercise. About the particular vulnerability of incarcerated women who occupy a position of almost total institutional dependence, about what meaningful oversight of correctional facilities actually requires when staffing and independent inspection, inaccessible reporting mechanisms genuinely insulated from institutional retaliation. These questions extend far beyond Idaho. They live in facilities across the country, in systems that have similarly received prey certifications while complaints accumulated beneath the surface. In systems where the architecture of silence is still intact, where the women inside are still calculating whether speaking is worth what it costs. Where grievance forms still enter processes managed by the institutions being grieved against. What the Idaho case demonstrated, ultimately, is that verified findings are more durable than institutional denial, that the documented words of women who chose to report, despite every structural pressure against it, outlasted the official narratives constructed to contain them. That is not a small thing. In environments designed to render certain voices permanently inaudible, the survival of those words matters. It matters for the women who wrote them. It matters for the women still inside facilities where similar dynamics exist and have not yet been documented. It matters for what we choose to believe accountability means in a democratic society that incarcerates more people than any other nation on earth. The walls of correctional facilities are designed to keep people in. They are not designed to keep truth contained indefinitely. Truth documented and verified and carried by people who refuse to stop speaking has a way of finding the outside world. This story found it. Others are still waiting. If this documentary moved you, if it made you think differently about what happens behind the walls we never see, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are more stories like this one, stories that deserve the same light. We'll keep bringing them to you.